We're sitting here in the Toorale wool shed, or Toorale. There's two ways to pronounce it. Henry Lawson walked down here at the end of 1892 with his mate Jim Gordon. He covered 50 kilometres and he came to this big wool shed here, 46 stands, owned by Sir Samuel Mackay. On the way, he began to get an impression of the bush that wasn't altogether favourable. Let me read a few things he said about some great Australian mistakes. For example, he said, "An Australian mirage does not look like water, it looks like it's just dry and dusty. The plain is not necessarily a wide open space covered with waving grass or green sward like a prairie. It's either a desert or a stretch of level country covered with wretched scrub. It's not glorious, grand and free to be on the track. Try it." So he'd already begun to get a sort of slightly jaundiced view of life in the bush carrying a swag. He lived over in the shearers' quarters here. Remember, it's the height of the union activities, so there's lots of union politics in the shed, and if you weren't a unionist, you got a tough time. Henry found it difficult because he was deaf, and so he felt a little bit on the outer. He was a bit more of a townie, he wasn't really a bushie, and I guess, you know, he wasn't the rugged sort of bush type. He worked on the wool shed board here as a rouseabout, picking up the wool, shifting it from where the shearers were to the tables to be sorted and so on. But he found it hard and a bit lonely, and his mate said he saw him just sort of lying on his bunk at night staring at the roof. So he wasn't sort of a charismatic character, but his deafness made him very astute. He was very clever at noticing and watching and sort of sketching characters, and so he drew a lot of characters out of the men he met here and worked among. So poems like "The Boss's Boots" came out of here, which was sort of a tongue-in-cheek thing about the boss would walk up and down the board here, checking on the shearers that they weren't sort of marking the sheep with their shears. These were the blade shears. Although this shed here was the first shed to use electricity, and Dunlop next door was the first to use mechanical shears anywhere in the world, and that had sort of tripped the shearers' strike because the men wanted to keep shearing with these because that's what they knew and they thought it was going to mean they were out of work. Mackay, who owned this station, had formed the Pastoralist Union to sort of fight the Shearers' Union. So you can imagine there was a certain amount of attention here on this station. So I suppose if W.G. Spence, who came to start the Shearers' Union, and they were sort of set to fight Mackay's Pastoralist Union, and it got quite violent. It spread to Sydney and along the river and up to Bourke. It's probably the closest we came to a civil war in Australia, and a lot of it was on this board here when Henry was here, and so when he's writing "The Boss's Boots" and Sweeney and the Greenhound Rouseabout and all these things, he's writing from the point of view of the men, because he's a battler, he's been on the track, he carries a swag, he sees the hardship of the men. I mean, imagine what it took to sort of work all day shearing sheep with a big pair of scissors like this. You'd have to be a pretty tough boy, and it's very, very hard work in a shed like this. He called them a hell. You know, he said these sheds are hell. There's corrugated iron, heat, you know, 120 degrees or something or other, and heaving sheep up and down here all day, and then over in the sheds there at night in pretty cramped and tough conditions. You had to be hard men, and so along with that, even though at times he sort of got on the wrong side of the shearers and he didn't always like the workers, he did identify with them, and of course the mateship ethic came out of that walking the track, doing the hard yards, to find mates who'd walk with you and see you through. We had a professor come on this trip, John Barnes from La Trobe University, and he wrote a paper after he came on the trip. He said, "I thought I'd said everything I wanted to say about Lawson," but he went home and wrote another essay and he said really what he saw here was that Lawson, in the immediate sense, when he's walking the hard yards in the heat, working in the sheds, he wrote a sort of a pretty grim picture of the bush and the hardships. But down the track, when he got distance on it, he wrote a much more romantic or softer or more friendly view of the bush as well, and more tongue-in-cheek. So Lawson sort of became known as the voice of the bush, even though he was only out here 6 months. But his experience of the bush became the lens through which he saw pretty much everything that he wrote about the outback and the bush. This was it, the time he had at the back of Bourke. So there's a poem or a story about the greenhound rouseabout in Sydney that he's sitting in a pub and they offer him lamb chops or lamb roast, and the last thing he wants to do is eat any more mutton. He'd been over in those shearing course over there with some miserable shearer's cook, and he had mutton for breakfast, mutton for lunch, mutton for tea. He said, no more mutton, give me beef, so he saw the downside of the bush, and the sort of, it wasn't all that romantic, but he did admire the men just the same.
Call this hot? I beg your pardon. Hot? You don't know what it means. What's that, waiter? Lamb or mutton? Thank you, mine is beef and greens. Bread and butter while I'm waiting. Milk? Oh yeah, bucketful. I'm just in from west, the Darlin, picking up and rolling wool. Mutton, stewed or chops for breakfast, dry and tasteless, boiled in fat. Bread or brownie, tea or coffee, 2 hours graft in front of that. Legs of mutton, boiled for dinner. Mutton, greasy, warm for tea. Mutton curried. Gave me order, beef and plenty greens for me. Breakfast, curried rice and mutton till you're in its sacrifice, and you sicken at the colour and the smell of curried rice all day long with living mutton, bits and belly wool and fleece, blinded by the yolk of wool, your shirt and trousers stiff with grease, till you long for sight of verdure, cabbage plots and water clear, and you crave for beef and butter as a boozer craves for beer. Dusty patch in baking mulga, glaring iron hut and shed, feel and smell of rain forgotten, water scarce and feed grass dead, hot and suffocating sunrise, all-pervading sheep yard smell. Stiff and aching green hand stretches, slushy rings the bullock bell, pint of tea and hunk of brownie, sinners string towards the shed, great black greasy crows round carcass, screen behind of dust cloud red. Engine whistles, go it tigers, and the agony begins, picking up for 7 devils out of Hades for my sins, picking up for 7 devils, 7 demons out of hell, sell their souls to get the bell sheep, 6 Christs they sell. Day grows hot as where they come from, too damned hot for men or brutes, roof of corrugated iron, 6'6" above the chutes, whiz and rattle and vibration like an endless chain of trams, blasphemy of 5 and 40, prickly heat and stink of rams. Bourke leaves his pen door open and the sheep come bucking out. When the rouser goes to pen 'em, Bourke blasts the rouseabout. Injury with insult added, trial of our cursing powers, cursed and cursing back enough to damn a dozen worlds like ours. Take the combs down to the grinder, will you? Seen me cattle pup? There's a sheep fell in me chute, just jump down and pick it up. Give the office when the boss comes. I'll catch that gory sheep, old man. Count the sheep in my pen, will you? Fetch me combs back when you can. When you get a chance, old fella, will you pop down to the hut, fetch me pipe, the cook'll show you, and I'll let you have a cut. Shearer yells for tar and needle, ringers roaring like a bull. Wool away, you son of angels, where the hell's the foundling wool? £1 a week and station prices mustn't kick against the pricks. 7 weeks of lurid mateship, ruined soul, and £4.6. What's that? Waiter? Me? Stuffed mutton? Look here, waiter, to be brief. I said beef. You blood-stained villain, beef. Moo cow, roast bullock, beef!
We're going to follow Henry from here. He walked away from here up towards the Warrego, which is over the other side of the plain there, where the Macaque had built some dams, the Boera Dam system. So Lawson walked up there towards Gumbailey, back into Bourke, for Christmas and then up the track to Hungerford. So we'll be following his steps there.